When we think of the Middle Ages, most of us conjure an era bound tightly by rigid doctrine, an age where every act related to sex was condemned as sin. Clergymen, men who themselves had renounced the flesh, held dominion over how others were allowed to love, to live, and even to think about desire. But as is so often the case, history is rarely as simple as the moral codes that survive it. In stark contrast to the Church's warnings, a paradoxical reality played out. Nobles kept mistresses in plain sight. Monks and priests were no strangers to clandestine affairs, and even the humblest of peasants found one another in the hay. So what is the truth? Let's find out in today's story. So fasten your seatbelt as we dive into today's mystery. But first, you just might have incredible luck if you like, and subscribe before this video ends. Sexual abstinence. Virtue or harm? In an age when physical purity was exalted as a supreme virtue, sexual abstinence was not merely a personal choice. It was a moral imperative imposed upon society at large. And yet, when we examine the medical thinking of the Middle Ages, a surprising contradiction emerges. Not everyone believed that refraining from sex was a path to holiness. In fact, among physicians of the time, it was often seen as the root of illness. According to the prevailing medical theories of the era, the human body functioned through the balance of 4 humors, and sexual activity was considered a natural mechanism to maintain that equilibrium. Suppressing sexual urges for too long, especially among young men, was thought to cause not only mental distress, but also serious physical harm. Symptoms such as headaches, weight loss, restlessness, and even sudden death were attributed directly to prolonged abstinence. One of the most cited examples supporting this belief was the death of King Louis VIII of France. During the Albigensian Crusade in the early 13th century, he remained unwaveringly faithful to the Queen and refrained from any sexual relations. But upon his return to Paris, the king suddenly fell ill and died shortly thereafter. At the time, many blamed his death not on war or exhaustion, but on the toll taken by his prolonged abstinence. It wasn't just kings who suffered. Crusading soldiers also found themselves caught in the same dilemma. A 12th century Norman poet, Ambrose, once wrote that during the siege of Acre, only about 3,000 soldiers were killed by the enemy, while an astonishing 100,000 died because they abstained for the love of God. One of the strangest stories came from a bishop in Liège, Belgium. Upon his promotion, he was required to adopt a life of celibacy. Determined to resist every carnal temptation, he embraced abstinence with all his will. But after a month of total denial, his body began to revolt. His genitals became grotesquely swollen, causing him immense pain and emotional collapse. His friends and family begged him to take a woman, but he stubbornly refused, and within days, he was dead. Masturbation, sin, and medicine. In the medieval worldview, masturbation existed on a precarious line between a condemned sin and a reluctantly tolerated form of treatment. It was viewed as a clear sign of spiritual weakness and a form of surrender to demonic temptation. And yet, ironically, it was the physicians of the time who occasionally came to its defense as a necessary remedy under certain circumstances. Medieval confessional manuals classified masturbation among the gravest sins, at times placing it on par with mispositioned intercourse, homosexuality, and even bestiality. Those who committed the act could be sentenced to severe penance, ranging from 30 days to 2 full years of continuous fasting. Still, not all contexts were judged equally. Masturbating alone was seen as a lesser offense than doing so with another person. And especially for the young and unmarried, the act might sometimes be overlooked. In stark contrast to religious doctrine, physicians of the period approached masturbation with a more pragmatic eye. They believed it was a way to relieve physiological pressure, restore the body's balance, and prevent the buildup of sexual energy, an accumulation that, in their view, could become harmful if left unchecked. To them, masturbation was not inherently wrong, so long as it was done in appropriate measure. But what happened when someone crossed the line? One well-known story, recorded by Albertus Magnus, tells of a young monk who struggled desperately to restrain his urges. In a fit of feverish compulsion, he relieved himself 70 times in a single night before morning prayers. By sunrise, he was found dead, his eyes severely damaged and his brain reportedly shrunken to the size of a small pomegranate. His death became a cautionary tale that even when justified by medical reasoning, excess and indulgence could carry grave consequences. For women, the situation was no less complicated. Through the lens of medieval medicine, if an unmarried woman experienced what was believed to be uterine suffocation, as described earlier, masturbation could be considered an acceptable therapeutic option. In cases where the patient was unable to carry out the act herself, a midwife or physician could perform the stimulation, ostensibly for healing, not for pleasure. According to some medical texts, such interventions were not seen as sinful when conducted for the purpose of preserving life. Still, whether framed as medicine or necessity, masturbation remained a subject shrouded in guilt and religious oversight. It was never just a physical act. It became a symbol of the struggle between flesh and faith, between what people felt to be natural and what society at the time compelled them to believe was morally wrong. Strange folk remedies of the Middle Ages. One of the most commonly used contraceptive methods during the Middle Ages involved sneezing immediately after intercourse, based on the belief that the sudden jolt would expel sperm from the body. And if that didn't work, women were advised to jump up and down several times after sex, in the hope that the vigorous movement might disrupt conception. Alongside these physical attempts, people also placed great faith in herbs and charms. Peppermint leaves, when rubbed around the genitals, were believed to block the entry of seminal fluid. But perhaps the strangest and most unsettling contraceptive method of all involved women wearing the testicles of a weasel around their necks as a kind of fertility talisman. To modern eyes, such a practice may seem bizarre, even grotesque, but it reflects the deeply superstitious worldview of the time. What's remarkable is that these folk remedies were passed down orally from generation to generation, often by midwives, village healers, or mothers themselves. Though not endorsed by the church and sometimes branded as heretical, they persisted nonetheless. In a world where a man's virility was closely tied to his honor, any hint of deficiency below the belt could become a source of unspoken shame. Despite the absence of modern medicine, the desire to enhance size and sexual performance was by no means a modern phenomenon. The people of the Middle Ages devised a wide array of so-called remedies, equal parts absurd and inventive. One method involved rubbing the penis with warm sheep's milk. The belief was that the heat and nourishment from the milk would nurture growth in the most sensitive part of the male body. Didn't work? Then came another, more elaborate recipe: crushed earthworms mixed with jujube oil, applied directly to the area in question. But perhaps the most disturbing of all was a folk remedy involving small sticks, used to strike the penis in hopes of stimulating blood flow and encouraging growth. Though it may sound like a cruel joke, several surviving folk texts describe this as an emergency measure for those suffering from extreme insecurity. These remedies, though fantastical by modern standards, reveal something very human. Insecurity over size is not a new invention. Even without social media, the image of the ideal man has cast its shadow for centuries. Strange medical theories and cures for sexual abstinence. And if sexual abstinence was believed to be a potential cause of illness, it should come as no surprise that medieval physicians also proposed a range of treatments for those deemed to be suffering from an excess of semen. One of the most common and disturbing remedies was bloodletting, a practice that reflected the era's medical reasoning. Physicians believed that if semen was not regularly expelled, it would transform into heat, rise to the head, and trigger mental disorders, headaches, or even death. To release the heat, doctors would cut open a vein and drain the body of its excess humors. Beyond bloodletting, crying and sweating were also recommended as morally acceptable ways to relieve physiological pressure. These activities were thought to help the body expel a portion of what could not be released through sexual means. In more urgent cases, some physicians even recommended masturbation under the guise of medical necessity, considering it a reasonable option for those who could not engage in lawful intercourse. And if these treatments for men were already controversial, the proposed methods for women were even more contentious. Physicians of the time believed that women too carried a kind of reproductive seed, referred to as the female essence, and that without regular release through intercourse, This essence would build up and cause a condition known as uterine suffocation. If the womb was not relieved, the consequences were described in dire terms. A woman might experience labored breathing, dizziness, fainting spells, or even sudden death. This condition was often diagnosed based on a woman's abnormal behavior, ranging from depression to nervous episodes, and was sometimes used as justification to control her sexual and social autonomy. The prescribed cure was marriage and regular intercourse in the missionary position, the only form sanctioned by the church. However, in cases where a woman could not marry, treatments included strict dietary restrictions, vinegar-based douches, or direct stimulation administered by a midwife or physician. Of course, by modern standards, these methods seem irrational, if not outright alarming. But they not only reflect the limited understanding of medicine at the time, they also reveal how sexuality was viewed and regulated in medieval society. Strange sins and bizarre punishments. In the medieval world, the concept of sin in matters of intimacy extended far beyond biblical prohibitions. It reached into the realm of the strange, the superstitious, and the folkloric, behaviors that today might be hard to believe ever existed in the form of formal laws. According to ecclesiastical law at the time, not all sexual acts within marriage were considered lawful. Positions outside of the missionary standard, even between husband and wife, could be condemned as sinful, as they were not believed to serve the purpose of procreation and were seen as excessively indulgent. And if that sounds overly severe, consider the charges the church prescribed for actions that defy even the wildest bounds of imagination. One of the most striking documents detailing such bizarre sexual sins was the Corrector, a compilation of church laws written in the 11th century by Burchard of Worms, a German bishop known for his rigid moralism. Among its most unusual passages was the description of a form of sexual sorcery, a woman kneading bread dough on her bare buttocks, then baking it and serving it to her husband, with the intention of making him burn with lust whenever he was near her. What sounds like a tale from rural folklore was, in Burchard's eyes, a grave offense, not merely a breach of decency, but a form of witchcraft. Using one's body as a magical instrument to manipulate another's will was considered a superstitious crime. The punishment for this act of erotic sorcery could be up to 2 years of penance. And the list didn't stop at bread making. Other acts, including bestiality or even touching one's partner for too long during intercourse, were meticulously detailed in these legal texts. What's more, punishments were not based solely on the act itself, but also on the status of the person committing it. A peasant might receive a lighter sentence than a noble or a cleric, figures whom society held to higher moral expectations. These peculiar sexual crimes reveal the deep-rooted obsession of the medieval church with controlling the human body. They served not only to regulate private behavior, but also to reinforce the absolute power of religion over every aspect of social life. Marjorie Kempe and celibacy within marriage. In medieval society, the notion of a wife openly demanding the right to refuse sexual relations with her husband was virtually unthinkable. And yet, in the midst of an era defined by rigid expectations and deep-rooted religious authority, Marjorie Kempe, a woman from East Anglia, stepped outside tradition and forged one of the most daring stories ever recorded from the period. Marjorie was neither a nun nor a noblewoman. She was a devout layperson with an intensely spiritual life. Married to John Kemp, she bore at least 14 children, a number not uncommon among medieval families. But after years consumed by pregnancy, childbirth, and the physical toll that came with them, Marjorie arrived at a life-altering decision. She wanted to live in celibacy, within her marriage. One afternoon in 1413, as the couple walked together toward the market, she shared her wish to dedicate herself fully to God, which meant relinquishing all marital intimacy. John replied with a mixture of disbelief and wounded pride, "Would you rather see me slain by the sword or lie with me once more?" Marjorie answered without hesitation, "I would rather see you slain." John, after some time spent wrestling with the idea, agreed to let Marjorie live in chastity, but only under 3 conditions. She must repay all of his debts, dine with him every Friday, and not withdraw entirely from his daily life. These terms formed the basis of an extraordinary agreement, one in which a medieval woman secured bodily autonomy within the bounds of marriage, despite the discouragement of both church law and societal norms. Marjorie's story was not merely an isolated case. It stands as a powerful reminder that even in the most repressive of eras, women found ways to negotiate, to assert themselves, and to reclaim control over their own bodies. Chivalric love and the ideal of purity. Chivalric love, also known as courtly love, was a concept of idealized, noble affection governed by ritual and restraint. This movement emerged from the courts of southern France in the late 11th century, particularly in the regions of Provence, Aquitaine, and Burgundy. It was here that writers and poets such as Chrétien de Troyes, Marie de France, and later Geoffrey Chaucer in England helped shape a new, almost revolutionary form of love for their time. In courtly love, affection did not require possession, nor did it necessarily involve physical intimacy. More often than not, it was a love unfulfilled, one-sided or forbidden, between a young knight and a married lady, or between individuals separated by class and station. In such relationships, the man was entirely devoted to the woman, willing to perform heroic deeds, or even risk death just to receive a tender glance, a word of praise, or the distant warmth of unspoken affection. The image of a knight standing in the cold, guarding a castle for the sake of love, became a symbol of longing untainted by desire. This very notion offered a kind of spiritual escape in medieval society, where love had long been recognized only within the bonds of marriage. Courtly love, through the subtle power of literature, challenged that conventional definition. It reimagined marriage not as a social contract, but as an emotional connection. Though rarely realized in daily life, the ideal of this refined, unattainable love left a lasting imprint on cultural values and perceptions of romance for generations to come. Virginity, more than a physical state. In medieval society, the notion of virginity was never limited to a physical condition. It was a spiritual ideal, a state in which both body and mind were expected to remain wholly pure. In the eyes of the Church, it was not necessary to commit a physical act to lose one's virginity. Even impure thoughts, or the quiet stirring of desire within the mind, were considered enough to tarnish this sacred form of innocence. Under this view, virginity ceased to be a biological trait and instead became a moral metric, a measure of one's inner virtue. Young people, particularly women, were encouraged to preserve this purity, not only in behavior but in thought, and once lost, it could only be atoned for through guilt, repentance, and penance, unless absolution was granted by God Himself. However, in certain cases, it was believed that virginity could be spiritually restored through profound purity of the soul, or through sincere and intense repentance. One of the most moving examples of this belief is the story of Marjorie Kemp. Though she had borne 14 children and was the lawful wife in a decades-long marriage, she was told by God that she would be made a virgin again upon entering heaven. But not everyone could follow Marjorie's path of prayer and devotion. For some, the obsession with purity led to acts of extreme and often painful self-denial. There were those who threw themselves into thorn bushes, believing that physical pain could burn away the sinful thoughts in their minds. Others submerged themselves in freezing water to purge carnal desire from their flesh. And more gravely still, there were monks and devotees who went so far as to castrate themselves. These actions were not merely the result of blind faith, they reflected the deep contradictions of the time. In that cultural and religious space, virginity was no longer a sign of innocence, but a punishing ideal, so unforgiving that some chose suffering over surrender in their desperate attempt to achieve it. Medieval sexuality, as we've just explored together, was never simply a matter of moral codes or religious doctrine. It revealed the deep contradictions of an era, one in which people yearned for sanctity, yet constantly wrestled with the primal instincts rooted within their very being. If today's story gave you even a moment of pause to reflect, don't hesitate to share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoy these strange but true journeys through forgotten history, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you won't miss what's coming next.